The rope snapped. Not frayed, not cut, snapped clean through as if it had been rotting for years, though the executioner had inspected it that very morning. The woman dropped to the platform, gasping, her neck unmarked. The crowd of 300 witnesses fell silent. They built a second gallows within the hour, using fresh hemp rope, thick as a man's wrist. When they placed the noose around her neck again, the wood beneath her feet splintered and collapsed before the trapdoor could even open. She stood in the wreckage, breathing steadily, while the sheriff's hands trembled so badly he couldn't light his pipe. By sunset, every overseer in Talbot County had refused to go near her. The county records show she was released 6 days later, though no official pardon was ever issued. What they don't show is why 12 men who'd built their fortunes on brutality suddenly couldn't bring themselves to touch a single enslaved woman, or what happened in the days between her first failed execution and her inexplicable freedom. Before we continue with the story of the woman they called Dinah, make sure you're subscribed to Liturgy of Fear. We bring you the darkest, most unsettling true stories from America's past, the ones that make you question everything you thought you knew about history. Comment below and tell us what state you're listening from. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those 6 days that changed Talbot County forever. The spring of 1867 brought unusual heat to Maryland's eastern shore, the kind of oppressive warmth that made clothes stick to skin and turned the air thick as molasses. Talbot County, wedged between the Chesapeake Bay and the Choptank River, had always been a place where old money clung to old ways with the tenacity of barnacles on a ship's hull. The war had ended 2 years prior, but the plantation economy hadn't died. It had simply renamed itself, put on new clothes, and continued much as it always had. Former slaves worked the same fields under new contracts that bound them just as tightly as chains ever had, with the added insult of being told they were now free. The county seat, Easton, bustled with merchants and lawyers who'd grown rich on tobacco and timber, men who wore their Confederate sympathies like Sunday suits despite the Union victory. The town's main street was lined with brick buildings, a courthouse with white columns, a bank, 3 churches, 2 hotels, and more taverns than anyone cared to count. On market days, farmers brought their produce to sell, and the square filled with wagons and horses and the smell of manure and tobacco. Black workers moved through the crowds with their eyes down, knowing that freedom was a word that meant different things depending on the color of your skin. The Hargrove estate sat 3 miles south of Easton, accessible by a dirt road that turned to mud whenever it rained. The property sprawled across 800 acres of prime farmland, with fields of tobacco, corn, and wheat that stretched to the tree line. The main house, a Georgian colonial built in 1789, stood on a slight rise overlooking the fields. It was an impressive structure. 3 stories of whitewashed brick with black shutters, 6 columns supporting a wide front porch, and a widow's walk on the roof where Thomas Hargrove's grandmother had once watched for ships coming up the Chesapeake. Behind the main house stood the overseer's cottage, a modest 2-room structure with a stone chimney. Further back were the tobacco barns, the smokehouse, the carriage house, and a row of 12 cabins where the workers lived. The same cabins they'd occupied before emancipation, with the same leaking roofs, the same dirt floors, the same sense of permanence and imprisonment. Thomas Hargrove was 63 years old in 1867, a tall man gone thick around the middle, with white hair and a face weathered by decades of sun and whiskey. His family had owned the estate since before the Revolution. His grandfather had fought in the Continental Army and been rewarded with land grants. His father had expanded the property through shrewd purchases and strategic marriages. Thomas himself had inherited the estate in 1834 and had run it with an iron fist for 33 years. He'd owned 60 enslaved people at the war's peak, and he'd made a fortune selling tobacco to European markets. The war had disrupted his business but hadn't destroyed it. By 1867, he employed 42 contract laborers, most of whom had nowhere else to go and no real choice but to sign contracts that paid them barely enough to survive. Dinah had been born on the Hargrove estate on a cold January night in 1831. No one recorded her mother's name in any official document, though the older workers remembered her as Ruth, a woman who'd been sold south when Dinah was 5 years old. Dinah's father had been a field hand named Jacob, sold to a plantation in Georgia when she was 3. She had no siblings that she knew of, though there were probably half-siblings scattered across the South, children of her father sold to different owners. She'd grown up in the cabins, raised by whoever had time to watch her, learning early that survival meant keeping your head down and your mouth shut. She'd worked the fields from the time she could walk, picking tobacco worms off plants, hauling water, gathering kindling. By 12, she was working full days alongside the adults, her hands already calloused and scarred. At 15, the overseer at the time, a man named Briggs who'd since died of cholera, had noticed her and decided she'd be better suited to housework. It was a common trajectory for young enslaved women, and it rarely ended well. But Dinah had been lucky, if you could call it that. The head cook, an older woman named Hattie, who'd been born on the estate and had worked in the main house for 40 years, had taken Dinah under her wing and taught her to cook. Hattie had no children of her own and seemed to see something in Dinah, a quickness, an intelligence, a capacity for learning that shouldn't be wasted in the fields. By the time Dinah was 20, she was head cook, a position she'd inherited when Hattie died of pneumonia in the winter of 1851. The job came with certain privileges: slightly better food, a cabin to herself, a measure of respect from the other enslaved people. But it also came with constant proximity to the Hargrove family, which meant constant danger. Thomas Hargrove's wife, Margaret, was a cold woman who ran the household with rigid efficiency and had no patience for mistakes. Their son, William, had been a spoiled, cruel boy who'd grown into a spoiled, cruel man. Dinah was tall, nearly 6 feet, with broad shoulders and strong hands. Her face was angular, with high cheekbones and deep-set eyes that seemed to look through people rather than at them. She wore her hair wrapped in a cloth, as was customary, and she moved with a quiet efficiency that made her nearly invisible when she wanted to be. People said she never smiled. They also said she had a way of looking at you that made you feel like she could see straight through to your bones, like she knew every secret you'd ever kept and every lie you'd ever told. The trouble that would eventually lead to the gallows started long before March 14, 1867, though that was the day everything came to a head. The roots of it went back to April 1865, when William Hargrove returned from the war. William had left for the war in 1861, a captain in the Confederate cavalry, full of romantic notions about honor and glory. He'd been 26 years old, handsome in his gray uniform, convinced that the war would be over in months, and that he'd return home a hero. Instead, he'd spent 4 years watching men die in increasingly horrific ways. He'd fought at Antietam, where the bodies had been stacked like cordwood. He'd been at Gettysburg, where he'd lost his left arm to a Union cannonball and been captured. He'd spent 18 months in a Union prison camp in Ohio, where men died of disease and starvation and cold, where the guards treated Confederate prisoners with a contempt that bordered on hatred. When he finally came home in late 1865, he was a different man. The romantic notions were gone, replaced by a rage that seemed to have no bottom and no target. He'd lost his arm, his health, and whatever sanity he'd once possessed. He couldn't sleep without laudanum, couldn't get through the day without whiskey. He had nightmares that left him screaming and sweating, visions of battles that wouldn't leave him alone. And he had a need to hurt people, to exert control, to prove that he still had power over something. His father, hoping that work would steady him, made him the estate's head overseer in January 1866. It was a disastrous decision. William took to his new role with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. He carried a leather strap on his belt and used it freely, despite the new laws that technically prohibited such things. He found reasons to punish workers for the smallest infractions: a row of tobacco planted slightly crooked, a tool left out overnight, a perceived look of disrespect. The workers learned to avoid him when possible, to move quickly when he was near, to never meet his eyes. The county sheriff, a man named Porter who'd served alongside Thomas Hargrove in the state militia 30 years prior, rarely investigated complaints from black workers. The few times he did, he found no evidence worth pursuing. The system protected its own, and men like William Hargrove were considered victims of the war, deserving of sympathy rather than prosecution. Dinah had managed to avoid William's attention for the most part. She worked in the main house, and he spent most of his time in the fields or in the overseer's cottage. But there were moments when their paths crossed, when he came into the kitchen demanding food or coffee, when he passed through the house on his way to see his father. During those moments, Dinah made herself as invisible as possible. She kept her eyes down, spoke only when spoken to, moved quickly and quietly. She'd survived 36 years on the Hargrove estate by knowing when to be seen and when to disappear. But on the morning of March 14, 1867, invisibility wasn't enough. It was a Thursday, and Dinah had been up since before dawn preparing breakfast for the Hargrove family. The kitchen was a separate building behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway. It was a hot, cramped space dominated by a massive iron stove that Dinah had to keep burning all day. The walls were blackened with soot, and the air was thick with the smell of smoke and cooking food. Dinah had been working on biscuits, bacon, eggs, and grits, the standard breakfast that Thomas Hargrove expected every morning at precisely 7 o'clock. The fire had been slow to catch that morning. The wood had been damp from recent rain, and Dinah had spent 20 minutes coaxing flames from smoking logs. By 6:30, she was behind schedule, and the water for coffee hadn't yet boiled. She was moving quickly, efficiently, trying to make up time, when William Hargrove came into the kitchen. He was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but drunk enough that his movements were loose and his eyes were unfocused. He'd been up all night, unable to sleep, drinking whiskey in the overseer's cottage. Now he wanted coffee, and he wanted it immediately. "Where's my coffee?" he demanded, his voice loud in the small space. "It's not ready yet, sir," Dinah said, keeping her eyes on the stove. "The fire was slow this morning. It'll be ready in a few minutes." "I don't want it in a few minutes. I want it now." "The water hasn't boiled yet, sir. I can't make coffee without boiling water." What happened next would be disputed in the trial, with different witnesses offering different versions. But the basic facts were these. William Hargrove, angry and drunk and looking for someone to hurt, grabbed Dinah's arm. She pulled away instinctively, a reflex born of 36 years of avoiding unwanted touch. He lunged forward, reaching for her again. His foot slipped on the wet floor. Dinah had been washing vegetables earlier, and water had pooled near the stove. He fell hard, his head striking the corner of the iron stove with a sound like a melon hitting pavement. He lay on the floor, blood pooling beneath his head, his eyes open but unseeing. Dinah stood frozen, staring at him, her mind racing. 3 other workers who'd been nearby, 2 women named Sarah and Bess who worked in the main house, and a man named Thomas who tended the gardens, came running when they heard the sound. They found Dinah standing over William's body, her face pale, her hands shaking. "He slipped," she said. "He grabbed me and I pulled away, and he slipped." Sarah and Bess would later testify to exactly that. They'd seen the whole thing through the kitchen window. William had been drunk and aggressive. Dinah had been trying to get away. He'd slipped on the wet floor. It was an accident, pure and simple. But Thomas Hargrove didn't see it that way. They carried William to his room in the main house and sent for Dr. Vickers, who arrived within the hour. He examined William, noting the skull fracture, the pooling blood, the lack of response. There was nothing he could do. William Hargrove died at 11 o'clock that morning without ever regaining consciousness. Thomas Hargrove stood over his son's body, his face grey, his hands clenched into fists. His only child was dead. The boy he'd raised, the man he'd hoped would inherit the estate and continue the family legacy, was gone, and someone had to pay. Sheriff Porter arrived that afternoon with 2 deputies. They arrested Dinah in the kitchen where she was cleaning up the blood. She didn't resist. She didn't say anything. She simply stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and let them put her in shackles. They took her to the county jail, a brick building behind the courthouse that had been built in 1820 and hadn't been updated since. It was a grim place. 6 cells, each barely large enough for a cot and a bucket, with barred windows that let in cold air but little light. The building smelled of mold and human waste and despair. Dinah was placed in the cell furthest from the door, the one usually reserved for the most dangerous prisoners. The jailer was a man named Pruitt, 68 years old, who'd worked in the courthouse for 30 years. He'd seen hundreds of prisoners come and go, drunks, thieves, murderers, runaway slaves before the war. He brought Dinah a plate of food that evening, cornbread and beans, and set it on the floor of her cell without meeting her eyes. "You got a trial scheduled for Monday," he said. 4 days from now." Dinah nodded but didn't speak. "You got anything you want to say?" Pruitt asked. "Anything you want me to tell anyone?" "No, sir," Dinah said quietly. Pruitt left, locking the heavy door behind him. Dinah sat on the cot and stared at the wall. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply sat, her mind working through what had happened and what was going to happen next. She knew how this would end. She'd seen it before. A black person accused of killing a white person had no chance in a Maryland court, especially not in Talbot County, especially not when the victim was Thomas Hargrove's son. The trial would be a formality. The verdict was already decided. Over the next 4 days, Dinah sat in that cell and waited. Pruitt brought her meals twice a day, simple food, but more than she'd often had as a slave. Other prisoners came and went, mostly men arrested for drunkenness or petty theft. They were kept in the cells near the front, and they were usually released within a day or two. Dinah was the only long-term prisoner, and the other inmates avoided looking at her, as if her fate might be contagious. On Saturday, Reverend Michaels came to visit. He was the minister of the White Baptist Church in Easton, a man in his 50s with thinning hair and soft hands who'd never done a day of manual labor in his life. He believed deeply in the salvation of souls, and he considered it his duty to minister to prisoners, especially those facing execution. He stood outside Dinah's cell with his Bible clutched to his chest and asked if he could pray with her. "If you want to, Reverend," Dinah said. He prayed for a long time, asking God to have mercy on Dinah's soul, to forgive her sins, to welcome her into heaven despite her crimes. Dinah listened politely, her face expressionless. When he finished, he looked at her expectantly. "Do you accept Jesus Christ as your Savior?" he asked. "I've been a Christian my whole life, Reverend," Dinah said. "But have you truly accepted him? Have you confessed your sins and asked for forgiveness?" "I've got nothing to confess that you'd understand," Dinah said quietly. Reverend Michaels frowned. "You killed a man. That's a sin that requires confession and repentance." "I didn't kill anyone," Dinah said, her voice steady. "He fell. It was an accident. The court will decide that," Michaels said. "But regardless of what the court says, you need to prepare your soul for judgment. You need to confess and repent." Dinah looked at him with those dark, steady eyes, and for a moment, Michaels felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in her gaze that made him deeply uncomfortable, something that suggested she saw through all his pious words to the fear and prejudice beneath. "I'll pray on it, Reverend," Dinah said finally. Michaels left, feeling unsettled in a way he couldn't quite name. He would visit Dinah twice more before the trial, and each time, he would leave feeling the same way, as if he'd been the one judged, rather than the one offering judgment. The trial took place on Monday, March 18th, in the Talbot County Courthouse. It was a grand building, at least by Easton standards, 2 stories of red brick with white columns and a clock tower. The courtroom was on the 2nd floor, a high-ceilinged space with tall windows and rows of wooden benches. By 9 o'clock, every seat was filled. The trial of a black woman for the murder of a white man was the kind of spectacle that drew crowds. Judge Carrington presided. He was 71 years old, a veteran of the Maryland judiciary who'd been appointed to the bench in 1839. He'd owned slaves himself before the war, and he made no secret of his belief that emancipation had been a mistake. He sat behind the bench in his black robes, his face stern, his gavel ready. The prosecutor was a young attorney named Stevens, 29 years old, ambitious and hungry for recognition. He'd only been practicing law for 3 years, but he'd already made a name for himself prosecuting black defendants. He saw this case as an opportunity to build his reputation further. The defense attorney was a court-appointed lawyer named Gaines, 34 years old, who'd been practicing for less than a year. He'd been assigned to Dinah's case 2 days before the trial and had barely had time to review the facts. He was nervous, inexperienced, and terrified of offending Judge Carrington or anyone else in the courtroom. Dinah sat at the defense table in her gray dress, her hands folded in her lap, her face expressionless. She didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at Thomas Hargrove, who sat in the front row with his wife, both of them dressed in black mourning clothes. She simply stared straight ahead, waiting. The trial lasted 4 hours, though the outcome was never in doubt. Stevens called Thomas Hargrove as his first witness. Hargrove took the stand and testified that his son had been a gentle soul, a war hero who'd suffered terribly in service to his country. He described William as kind, patient, beloved by everyone who knew him. He said that Dinah had always been difficult, that she'd harbored resentment for years, that he'd seen it in her eyes. He claimed that she'd murdered his son in cold blood, that she'd struck him with a pot or a pan. The story changed depending on which moment of his testimony you listened to, and that she'd shown no remorse. Gaines tried to cross-examine, but Judge Carrington shut him down repeatedly, ruling his questions improper or irrelevant. The jury, 12 white men who'd all lost something in the war, watched Thomas Hargrove with sympathetic eyes. Stevens then called Dr. Vickers, who testified that William had died of a skull fracture consistent with a blow to the head. When Gaines asked if the injury could have been caused by a fall, Vickers admitted it was possible, but Stevens quickly redirected, asking if it could also have been caused by being struck with a heavy object. Vickers agreed that it could. Finally, Gaines called his witnesses, Sarah, Bess, and Thomas, the 3 workers who'd seen what happened. All 3 testified that William had been drunk, that he'd grabbed Dinah, that she'd pulled away, and that he'd slipped on the wet floor. All 3 were adamant that it had been an accident, but Stevens tore into them on cross-examination. He suggested they were lying to protect Dinah. He pointed out that they were all black, all employed by Thomas Hargrove, all dependent on his goodwill for their survival. He implied that they'd been coached, that they were part of a conspiracy. By the time he was done, their testimony had been thoroughly discredited in the eyes of the jury. Dinah never took the stand. Gaines advised against it, knowing that anything she said would be twisted and used against her. So she sat silently while her fate was decided by people who'd made up their minds before the trial even started. Judge Carrington's instructions to the jury were brief and pointed. He explained that murder required intent, but that intent could be inferred from actions. He noted that Dinah had been alone with William when he died, that she'd had the opportunity and the means to kill him. He suggested that the testimony of the black witnesses should be viewed with skepticism, given their obvious bias. The jury deliberated for 20 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood and announced the verdict: guilty of murder. Judge Carrington sentenced Dinah to hang. Execution was scheduled for April 2nd, giving Thomas Hargrove time to arrange for a proper public spectacle. Hangings had become less common since the war, but they still drew crowds, especially when the condemned was black and the victim was white. Dinah was taken back to her cell. She'd shown no emotion during the trial, and she showed none now. She simply walked between the deputies, her head up, her face calm, as if she'd expected nothing different. Over the next 2 weeks, Dinah sat in that cell and waited for death. Pruitt continued to bring her meals, but he no longer tried to make conversation. He set the food down and left quickly, as if he didn't want to be in her presence any longer than necessary. Other prisoners, held in adjacent cells for minor crimes, asked to be moved. One man, arrested for public drunkenness, became so agitated by Dinah's presence that he spent an entire night screaming about demons and hellfire. Sheriff Porter released him early just to restore peace. Reverend Michaels visited 3 more times, each visit following the same pattern. He would pray, ask Dinah to confess, and leave feeling unsettled when she refused. On his final visit, the day before the execution, he begged her to accept salvation. "Tomorrow you'll face God's judgment," he said. "You need to be right with him." "I am right with him," Dinah said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong. You killed a man. I didn't kill anyone. He fell. The jury said you're guilty." "The jury said what they were always going to say," Dinah replied. "That doesn't make it true." Michaels left, frustrated and frightened in equal measure. That evening, he told his wife that there was something deeply wrong with Dinah, something unnatural. His wife, a practical woman who'd been married to him for 25 years, told him he was being foolish. But Michaels couldn't shake the feeling. Meanwhile, Thomas Hargrove was making preparations for the execution. He paid for a new gallows to be built in the courthouse square, a sturdy platform of oak with a trapdoor mechanism imported from Baltimore. He hired an executioner from Richmond, a man named Cobb, who claimed to have hanged 17 people without a single botched job. Cobb arrived in Easton 3 days before the execution, inspected the gallows, and pronounced them satisfactory. He was a professional, and he took pride in his work. A proper hanging was a science, he liked to say. Too short a drop and the condemned strangled slowly, too long and the head could separate from the body. He'd calculated a 7-foot drop for Dinah, based on her height and weight, which should break her neck cleanly and cause death within seconds. The morning of April 2nd dawned clear and warm, the kind of spring day that made everything feel possible. By 9 o'clock, more than 300 people had gathered in the courthouse square. They came from all over the county, farmers and merchants, women in their Sunday dresses, children eating peppermint sticks. Someone had set up a lemonade stand near the courthouse steps. Another vendor was selling roasted peanuts. The atmosphere felt almost festive, like a county fair or a holiday celebration. The gallows stood in the center of the square, a stark wooden structure that cast long shadows in the morning sun. Cobb inspected it one final time, checking the trapdoor mechanism, testing the rope, measuring the drop distance. Everything was perfect. He'd used the best hemp rope he could find, thick as a man's wrist, strong enough to hold a horse. He'd tested it that morning, hanging a sack of grain that weighed approximately the same as Dinah. The rope had held without any sign of strain. At 10 o'clock, the courthouse doors opened, and Sheriff Porter emerged with Dinah between 2 deputies. She wore the same gray dress she'd been arrested in, now stained and wrinkled from 2 weeks in a cell. Her hands were bound in front of her with rough rope. She walked steadily, her head up, her face expressionless. The crowd quieted as she appeared, hundreds of eyes watching her every move. She climbed the 13 steps to the platform slowly, her bound hands making balance difficult. When she reached the top, she stood in the center of the trapdoor and looked out over the crowd. Her gaze swept across the faces, white faces mostly, though there were a few black workers standing at the back, their expressions carefully neutral. She saw Thomas Hargrove in the front row, his face hard with satisfaction. She saw Reverend Michaels clutching his Bible. She saw children, some as young as 5 or 6, watching with wide eyes. Sheriff Porter read the sentence aloud, his voice carrying across the square. Dinah, a Negro woman, having been found guilty of the murder of William Hargrove, is hereby sentenced to hang by the neck until dead. May God have mercy on her soul. Cobb stepped forward and placed the noose around Dinah's neck, adjusting it carefully so that the knot sat just behind her left ear. He pulled a black hood from his pocket, but before he could place it over her head, Dinah spoke. Her voice was clear and strong, loud enough that people at the back of the crowd could hear every word. "I didn't kill that man," she said. "He fell. But you don't care about truth. You never have. You just need someone to punish, someone to hurt, because that's all you know how to do." Thomas Hargrove stood up, his face red with rage. "Proceed," he shouted. Cobb pulled the hood over Dinah's head, blocking out the light, the faces, the world. Dinah stood in darkness, feeling the rough hemp against her neck, hearing the murmur of the crowd, the creak of wood beneath her feet. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs one last time. Cobb stepped back and nodded to his assistant, a young man named Miller, who'd been hired specifically for this job. Miller pulled the lever that released the trapdoor. Dinah dropped. The rope snapped. The sound was like a gunshot, sharp and clean, echoing across the square. Dinah hit the ground beneath the gallows, landing hard on her side. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd stood frozen, staring at the broken rope still dangling from the crossbeam. Then someone screamed, and chaos erupted. Cobb scrambled down from the platform, his face pale. He pulled the hood off Dinah's head. She was conscious, gasping for air, her neck showing only a red mark where the rope had been. Cobb stared at her, then at the broken rope, then back at her. His hands were shaking. Sheriff Porter climbed onto the platform and examined the rope himself. The end was clean, as if it had been cut with a knife, though Cobb had inspected it just minutes before. Porter looked at Cobb, who was now sitting on the edge of the platform with his head in his hands. "How is this possible?" Porter demanded. "I don't know," Cobb said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I tested that rope this morning. It was sound. It should have held." The crowd was in an uproar now, people pushing forward to see better, others backing away, mothers pulling their children close. The black workers at the back of the crowd stood very still, their faces carefully blank, but their eyes were wide. Porter made a decision. "Build another gallows," he said. "Use new rope. We'll try again this afternoon." They took Dinah back to her cell while carpenters constructed a second gallows. This time, they decided to use the old hanging tree at the edge of town, a massive oak that had been used for executions before the war. The tree was at least 200 years old, with branches thick as a man's body. They'd hanged 7 people from that tree over the years, and it had never failed. Cobb went to 3 different suppliers and brought back samples of rope. He tested each one, pulling on them with all his strength, hanging weights from them, examining every inch for signs of weakness. He chose the thickest one, hemp rope that could have held a horse, rope that showed no signs of wear or damage. By 3 o'clock, everything was ready. The crowd had grown, word of the failed hanging had spread through town, and now nearly 500 people packed the area around the oak tree. Some had come out of curiosity, others whispered about signs and omens. A few of the black workers from surrounding farms had walked into town, standing at the back of the crowd, their faces neutral, but their eyes watchful. They brought Dinah out again. She looked exactly as she had that morning, calm, steady, her eyes fixed on some distant point. If she was afraid, she didn't show it. If she was surprised to still be alive, she gave no indication. She simply walked between the deputies, climbed onto the platform that had been built beneath the oak tree's largest branch, and stood where they told her to stand. This time, there were no speeches. Cobb, visibly nervous now, placed the noose around her neck and stepped back quickly, as if he didn't want to touch her any longer than necessary. He nodded to Miller, who pulled the lever. The trap door, a simple wooden platform rigged to drop away, opened. Dinah fell. The wood beneath her feet splintered with a sound like breaking bones, like the world itself was coming apart. The entire platform collapsed, sending Dinah, Miller, and 2 carpenters who'd been standing nearby, tumbling to the ground in a shower of splinters and dust. The rope, still intact, swung empty above them. Dinah lay in the wreckage, coughing, covered in dust. Miller had broken his arm and was screaming in pain. One of the carpenters had a gash across his forehead that bled profusely. The other carpenter was unconscious, having hit his head on a piece of falling timber. Dinah had a scrape on her cheek and nothing else. The crowd had gone silent again, but this time the silence felt different. Heavy. Afraid. People were backing away now. Mothers clutching their children, men crossing themselves. Someone in the crowd shouted, "Witchcraft!" Another voice called out, "The devil protects his own." Cobb refused to try a third time. He stood up. brushed the dust from his clothes, and announced that he was done. He packed his equipment, collected his fee from a stunned Sheriff Porter, and left town that evening. He would later tell people in Richmond that he wanted nothing more to do with Talbot County or its cursed hangings, that there were forces at work there that he didn't understand and didn't want to understand. Sheriff Porter stood in the wreckage of the second gallows, staring at Dinah, who sat in the dirt with her hands still bound, looking back at him with those steady, unreadable eyes. Around them, the crowd was dispersing, people hurrying away as if they didn't want to be there when whatever was protecting Dinah decided to turn its attention to them. "Take her back to the jail," Porter said finally, his voice hoarse. That night, Thomas Hargrove called an emergency meeting at his estate. He invited Sheriff Porter, Judge Carrington, Prosecutor Stevens, and the 3 overseers who worked his land, men named Dutch, Farley, and Quinn. They gathered in Hargrove's study, a wood-paneled room lined with law books and hunting trophies, and discussed what to do about Dinah. The study was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Hargrove poured whiskey for everyone, and they drank in silence for a moment, each man lost in his own thoughts. "We hang her again," Hargrove said finally. "Tomorrow. Use chain instead of rope." Dutch, the oldest of the overseers, shook his head. He was 56 years old, a thick-shouldered man who'd worked the Hargrove estate for 20 years. He'd seen a lot in his time, runaways, rebellions, punishments that would make most people sick. But he'd never seen anything like what had happened that day. "Chain won't break her neck," he said. "She'll strangle. Could take 10 minutes or more. You want to watch that?" "I don't care how long it takes," Hargrove said, his voice hard. "She killed my son. She needs to die." But Judge Carrington was shaking his head. "We can't," he said. "Not after today. You saw that crowd. People are talking. If we try again and something else goes wrong." He trailed off, but everyone understood. The whispers had already started. Witchcraft, devil's protection, divine intervention. The kind of talk that could spread like wildfire through a superstitious community. "So what do you suggest?" Hargrove demanded. "We let her go. She killed my son." "She was convicted and sentenced," Carrington said carefully. "We attempted to carry out that sentence. Twice. If we try again and fail, we look like fools. Worse, we look like we're fighting against something bigger than us." The room fell quiet. Outside, spring peepers sang in the darkness, their chorus rising and falling like breathing. Finally, Quinn spoke up. He was the youngest of the overseers, 32 years old, a man who'd built his reputation on being willing to do things others wouldn't. "Maybe we don't need a trial," he said. "Maybe we handle this quietly. An accident. She tries to escape. We shoot her. No one would question it." Sheriff Porter looked at him with disgust. "I'm not murdering a prisoner," he said. "I may not like what happened today, but I'm still a lawman." "Then what do we do?" Hargrove demanded. Porter took a long drink of whiskey. "We keep her in jail," he said. "Let things settle. In a few months, when people have forgotten, we'll handle it quietly. Move her to another county, have her tried again there." Hargrove wanted to argue, but he could see the fear in the other men's eyes. Even Quinn, who'd once beaten a man half to death for stealing a chicken, looked uncomfortable. They were all thinking the same thing, though none of them wanted to say it aloud. What if she really was protected by something they didn't understand? The meeting ended without a clear resolution. The men left one by one, hurrying to their horses as if they didn't want to be out after dark. Hargrove sat alone in his study, drinking whiskey and staring at the portrait of his son that hung above the fireplace. William looked young in the painting, barely 20, dressed in his Sunday best, smiling. It had been painted before the war, before everything had gone wrong. Hargrove sat there until dawn, drinking and remembering, and by the time the sun rose, he'd made a decision. He would wait, as Porter suggested, but he wouldn't wait forever. One way or another, Dinah would pay for what she'd done. But things didn't go according to plan. The next morning, Dutch came to the estate and told Hargrove he was quitting. He'd found work in Delaware, he said, managing a farm for a Quaker family. Better pay, better conditions. He'd be leaving by the end of the week. Hargrove tried to convince him to stay, offering more money, better accommodations. But Dutch was adamant. He wouldn't say why exactly, but Hargrove could see it in his eyes. Fear. Farley quit that afternoon. He claimed his wife was sick and needed to move to a drier climate, somewhere out west. He'd be leaving within the month. Quinn lasted until the following Monday, then announced he was moving to Ohio. His brother had land there, he said, and had offered him a partnership. It was too good an opportunity to pass up. Within 10 days, Thomas Hargrove had no overseers left. And when he tried to hire replacements, he found that no one wanted the job. He offered double the usual wages. He offered housing, meals, even a share of the profits. But word had spread throughout the county, and no one wanted anything to do with the Hargrove estate. Men who'd spent their entire lives enforcing discipline through fear suddenly found themselves afraid. They made excuses, family obligations, health problems, better opportunities elsewhere. But Hargrove knew the truth. They were terrified of Dinah. The workers on the Hargrove estate noticed the change immediately. Without overseers, the brutal discipline that had governed their lives evaporated. They still worked the fields, but at their own pace. They took breaks when they needed them. They talked freely. And some of them began to leave, walking away from their contracts to find work elsewhere, and no one stopped them. Thomas Hargrove, who'd built his fortune on control, found himself powerless. He tried to manage the estate himself, but he was 63 years old and had never done manual labor in his life. He hired a new overseer from another county, but the man lasted 3 days before quitting, claiming he'd had nightmares every night about a tall black woman with eyes that saw through walls. By the end of April, half of Hargrove's workers had left. By the end of May, he'd lost 3/4 of them. The fields went unplanted. The tobacco rotted in the barns. The estate that had been in his family for 3 generations was falling apart, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. In her cell, Dinah waited. Jailer Pruitt continued to bring her meals, but he no longer met her eyes. He set the food down and left quickly, locking the door behind him with trembling hands. Other prisoners, held in adjacent cells for minor crimes, asked to be moved. The cell next to Dinah's remained empty, even when the jail was crowded. On the 6th day after the second failed hanging, Reverend Michaels visited Dinah again. This time he didn't come to pray. He came to ask questions. He stood outside her cell, his Bible clutched to his chest like a shield, and stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "What are you?" he said finally. Dinah looked at him calmly. "I'm a woman who didn't kill anyone," she said. "Same as I've always been. The rope broke. The platform collapsed. That's not natural. Maybe your rope was rotten. Maybe your carpenters did poor work. I inspected that rope myself," Michael said, his voice rising. "It was sound, and the platform was built by the best carpenters in the county. What happened shouldn't have been possible." Dinah smiled for the first time since her arrest. A small, cold smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Then maybe," she said softly, "God doesn't want me dead." The words hung in the air between them. Michaels felt a chill run down his spine, despite the warm spring air. He wanted to argue, to tell her that God didn't work that way, that divine intervention didn't happen for murderers, but he couldn't get the words out, because deep down, in a place he didn't want to examine too closely, he wondered if she might be right. He left without another word. That evening, he went to Judge Carrington's house and told him that Dinah needed to be released. The judge, who'd been losing sleep over the entire situation, agreed. The next morning, Sheriff Porter unlocked Dinah's cell and told her she was free to go. No official pardon was issued. No explanation was given. The court records simply note that the sentence was suspended pending further review, though no review ever took place. It was as if the entire system had simply given up, unable to reconcile what had happened with any rational explanation. Dinah walked out of the courthouse into the April sunshine, still wearing her gray dress, and disappeared into the crowd. She didn't return to the Hargrove estate. She didn't say goodbye to anyone. She simply walked away, and no one tried to stop her. No one knew where she went. Some people claimed they saw her boarding a train to Baltimore. Others said she'd headed south toward Virginia or north toward Pennsylvania. A few insisted she'd never left Talbot County at all, that she was still there, living quietly somewhere in the woods or in one of the small black communities that had sprung up after emancipation. Thomas Hargrove tried to rebuild his operation, but he never recovered. Without overseers, he couldn't maintain control over his workers. Without workers, he couldn't plant or harvest his crops. By 1868, the estate was barely functional. He sold it in 1870 to a Baltimore businessman who turned it into a horse farm. Hargrove moved to Baltimore with his wife and died 3 years later of a stroke. The Hargrove house stood empty for years before being torn down in 1891. The story of Dinah's failed hanging spread throughout Maryland and beyond. Newspapers picked it up, though they reported it as a curiosity rather than serious news. The Baltimore Sun ran a brief article titled, "Twice Hanged Woman Walks Free," treating it as an amusing oddity. The Philadelphia Inquirer published a longer piece that speculated about the quality of the rope and the construction of the gallows. But none of the newspapers asked the deeper questions. Why the overseers had quit, why no one would work for Hargrove, why an entire system of oppression had collapsed in the face of one woman's survival. In the black communities of the Eastern Shore, the story took on a different meaning. Dinah became a symbol, proof that sometimes, against all odds, justice could prevail, or at least that injustice could fail. Her story was told in churches and at gatherings, passed down from parents to children, embellished and mythologized over time. In some versions, the rope broke 3 times. In others, Dinah spoke prophecy from the gallows, predicting the fall of the Hargrove estate. In still others, she was visited by angels in her cell who promised her protection. But the core of the story remained the same. A woman who was supposed to die, who everyone expected to die, who the system demanded must die, and who walked away. In the years that followed, people tried to explain what had happened. Some said the rope had been sabotaged, though no one could explain how or by whom, given that Cobb had inspected it himself and had no reason to want Dinah to survive. Others pointed to the poor quality of the gallows construction, though the carpenters who'd built both structures were experienced men who'd never had a failure before or after. A few suggested that the whole thing had been staged, that Sheriff Porter had secretly arranged for Dinah's escape because he knew she was innocent. But Porter maintained until his death in 1889 that he'd done everything by the book, that he'd been as shocked as anyone by what had happened. The most persistent theory, whispered in churches and general stores, was that Dinah had been protected by something beyond human understanding. Not witchcraft exactly, that was too pagan for a Christian community to accept openly, but perhaps divine intervention. Perhaps God had stayed the executioner's hand, just as he'd stayed Abraham's hand when he'd been about to sacrifice Isaac. It was a comforting thought for some, terrifying for others, but there was another explanation, one that few people wanted to consider, that the entire system of justice in Talbot County had been so rotten, so fundamentally corrupt, that it had collapsed under its own weight. The rope hadn't broken because of supernatural intervention. It had broken because the men who tied it were so convinced of their own righteousness that they'd grown careless. The platform hadn't collapsed because of divine will. It had collapsed because it had been built by men who'd spent so long brutalizing others that they'd forgotten how to do honest work. Dinah hadn't been protected by God or the devil. She'd been protected by the sheer incompetence and moral bankruptcy of the system that had tried to kill her. In 1872, a journalist from Philadelphia named Harrison Webb traveled to Talbot County to investigate the story. He was a young man, 28 years old, who worked for the Philadelphia Press and had a reputation for thorough, skeptical reporting. He spent 3 weeks in Easton, interviewing dozens of people, former slaves, white landowners, court officials, anyone who'd been there that day or who knew someone who had been. He published his findings in a series of 5 articles that ran in several northern newspapers. His conclusion was simple and rational. The hangings had failed due to a combination of poor equipment, inadequate construction, and mass hysteria. The rope had been weakened by moisture and age despite appearances. The platform had been inadequately constructed, using wood that had been compromised by rot. And the crowd's expectations of failure had created a self-fulfilling prophecy, causing the executioners to rush their work and make mistakes. It was a rational explanation. It satisfied some people, particularly those in the north, who wanted to believe that there was nothing mysterious about what had happened, that it could all be explained by science and logic. But Webb's explanation didn't account for everything. It didn't explain why 3 experienced overseers had quit their jobs within days of the failed hangings. It didn't explain why no one in Talbot County would work for Thomas Hargrove afterward. It didn't explain the look in Dinah's eyes, that steady, knowing look that had made grown men turn away. And it didn't explain why Cobb, a professional executioner with 17 successful hangings to his credit, had been so shaken by what happened that he never worked in Maryland again. The truth, as always, was probably more complicated than any single explanation. Maybe the rope was faulty. Maybe the platform was poorly built. Maybe the overseers quit because they'd seen something in Dinah's survival that reminded them of their own mortality, their own vulnerability. Maybe they'd realized that the power they'd wielded for so long was an illusion, that it could be broken as easily as a rope or a wooden platform. Or maybe, just maybe, there were forces at work that couldn't be explained by rational analysis. Not supernatural forces necessarily, but the kind of deep, inexplicable currents that run through human history. The kind that make one man's bullet miss while another's finds its mark. The kind that make one ship sink while another survives the same storm. The kind that make a rope snap at exactly the right moment. In 1881, a woman matching Dinah's description was reported living in Philadelphia, working as a seamstress in a shop on South Street. A former Talbot County resident named Marcus Bellamy claimed to have seen her at a church social. He approached her, certain it was Dinah, but she denied it. She said her name was Sarah Collins, that she'd lived in Philadelphia her entire life, that she'd never been to Maryland. Bellamy insisted it was her. He said he'd never forget those eyes, that way she had of looking through you rather than at you, but he didn't press the matter. He simply nodded and walked away, and he never saw her again. If it was Dinah, she'd built a new life for herself. She'd escaped not just the gallows, but the entire world that had tried to destroy her. She'd become someone else, someone free. And maybe that was the real miracle, not that she'd survived 2 hangings, but that she'd survived at all. That she'd found a way to live in a world that had never wanted her to exist. The courthouse in Easton still stands, though it's been renovated several times. The jail where Dinah was held was demolished in 1923, replaced by a parking lot. The oak tree where the second hanging was attempted died in 1897, killed by disease, and was cut down. The Hargrove estate is now a subdivision called Hargrove Meadows, rows of identical houses where tobacco fields once stretched to the horizon. There's no historical marker, no plaque commemorating what happened there. Most people who live there now have never heard of Dinah, or the hangings that failed, or the system that collapsed. But in the black churches of Maryland's eastern shore, the story is still told. It's passed down from grandmothers to grandchildren, a reminder of a time when the law was a weapon and survival was a form of resistance. The details change with each telling. Sometimes the rope breaks 3 times, sometimes Dinah speaks prophecy from the gallows, sometimes she's visited by angels in her cell. But the core of the story remains the same. A woman who was supposed to die, who everyone expected to die, who the system demanded must die, and who walked away. What really happened in those 6 days between the first failed hanging and Dinah's release? The official records don't say, they can't say, because the truth was too uncomfortable to write down. A black woman had defied execution twice, and rather than try a 3rd time, the white men who ran Talbot County had simply given up. They'd let her go because they were afraid of looking foolish, afraid of public opinion, afraid of something they couldn't name. That fear was more powerful than any rope or gallows. It was the fear of losing control, of admitting that the system they'd built and benefited from was fundamentally unjust. And in the end, that fear saved Dinah's life more surely than any divine intervention could have. The story of Dinah raises questions that still resonate today. What does it mean when justice fails? What happens when the machinery of oppression breaks down, even temporarily? And what kind of strength does it take to stand on a gallows twice and walk away both times? We may never know what Dinah was thinking as she stood on that platform, the noose around her neck, waiting for the drop. We may never know if she believed she would survive, or if she'd simply accepted her fate with a dignity that her executioners could never understand. But we know this: she survived. Against all odds, against all expectations, against a system designed to crush people like her, she survived. And sometimes, survival is the greatest victory of all. What do you think happened to Dinah after she was released? Do you believe the hangings failed due to faulty equipment, or was something else at work? Leave your comment below and share your theory. If you found this story as haunting as we did, hit that like button, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more forgotten tales from America's dark past, and share this video with someone who appreciates history's most unsettling mysteries. The past has more secrets than we can imagine, and we're here to uncover them, one story at a time.